1:46 p.m. Atlanta heat fading, clock ticking. Darius Cole has 14 minutes to reach the courthouse. 14 minutes to end 6 years of parole. One hearing, one shot. Then he sees it. Black sedan crushed into the median, smoke rising. An older woman trapped, bleeding. People standing back, phones up, no one moving. His engine's still running. If he stops, he loses everything. If he doesn't, he loses something else. What would you do? And where are you watching from? The late Atlanta sun hung low, thin and fading, casting long shadows across the highway as if time itself were stretching its final warning. Darius Cole gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. At 32, his face carried quiet endurance, short-cropped hair, a faint scar along his jaw from a fight he never spoke about, and eyes that had learned to measure every second like it mattered. Because today, it did. 14 minutes. That was all he had left to reach Fulton County Courthouse. 14 minutes to close the last door on 6 years of parole, 6 years of waking before dawn, checking in, proving, again and again, that he was no longer the man who made that one reckless decision at 22. His eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. 1:46 p.m. "You're not messing this up," he muttered under his breath, voice low, steady, like he was speaking to someone else inside him. Maybe he was. For a moment, the city blurred past him. Glass buildings, tired traffic lights, people who didn't know him and never would. A clean life was waiting on the other side of this hearing. No more check-ins, no more looking over his shoulder, just forward. Then something broke the rhythm. A black luxury sedan sat crooked against the median, its front crushed inward like a breath that never finished. Smoke curled lazily from under the hood. Time slowed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough for Darius to feel it. A small crowd had gathered. 5, maybe 6 people, phones raised, feet planted, no one moving closer. Darius's chest tightened. "Keep driving," a voice inside him whispered. Practical, cold. "You've got 14 minutes. Another voice, quieter, older, said nothing at all. It didn't need to. His foot hovered over the gas. Then he exhaled, long and heavy, like surrender. The car pulled over. By the time Darius reached the wreck, he was already slipping on a pair of worn latex gloves from his glove compartment. Habit, instinct, muscle memory from his EMT certification days. The one thing he had kept, even when everything else in his life had fallen apart. Inside the car, an elderly woman sat pinned behind the wheel. Eleanor Whitfield, though he didn't know her name yet, looked to be in her late 60s, silver hair disheveled, her pale skin streaked with blood from a deep cut above her left eye. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. "Ma'am, don't move," Darius said, his voice immediately calm, grounded, the kind of voice people trusted without knowing why. "I'm here," her lips trembled. I can't feel my legs." Darius swallowed, pushing down the spike of urgency rising in his chest. He checked her airway, and then her breathing, then the wound. Too much blood, pupils uneven, possible spinal injury. "Okay," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "We're not rushing this." He placed his hands carefully along her neck, stabilizing her, every movement slow, deliberate. Around him, the world continued like a bad joke. Cars passing, phones recording, someone whispering. Is she alive? Darius blocked it all out. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eleanor." "All right, Eleanor," he said softly. "Stay with me. Just listen to my voice. You're not alone." Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to rise, faint at first, then growing. Darius didn't look at the clock again. He didn't need to, because now, time wasn't his anymore. Minutes passed, 5, maybe 6, but they felt like something heavier, something irreversible. He kept talking to her, grounding her, keeping her conscious, even as the fear crept quietly into his own chest. This was it. The moment everything balanced, the life he had been building, and the person he had become. The ambulance arrived in a rush of sound and motion. Paramedics took over, quick, efficient. Darius stepped back without ceremony, already pulling off his gloves. No one stopped him. No one asked his name. And maybe that was right. He ran. Back in his car, the engine roared louder than before, or maybe it was just his heartbeat. The city no longer blurred. It resisted him. Every red light, every slow turn felt like something pulling him backward. 2:17 p.m., 17 minutes late. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, but when he stepped inside, it was already over. "Docket's closed," the clerk said without looking up. "Judge already left." The words didn't hit all at once. They settled slowly, like dust. Darius stood there longer than necessary, then nodded once, almost politely, and turned away. That night, he sat in his driveway, engine off, hands still resting on the wheel. 6 years, gone. His phone rang at 9:14 p.m., unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Hello?" A pause, then a voice, calm, official. "Is this Darius Cole?" "Yes." Another pause. Then, "She asked us to find you." Darius didn't move, because something in the way those words landed told him this story wasn't over. Morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of Grady Memorial Hospital, pale and sterile, as if the world had been washed clean, but left something unresolved beneath the surface. Darius Cole stood just inside the entrance, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, the same one he had owned for 3 years, clean but faded at the edges, like a life carefully held together. He hadn't slept much. The phone call from the night before still echoed in his mind, replaying in fragments. "She asked us to find you. No explanation, no context, just a thread pulling him here." Hospitals had a way of slowing time, but not easing it. At the front desk, a young nurse named Lila Chen, a woman in her late 20s with tied-back black hair and tired but attentive eyes, shaped by years of night shifts and quiet emergencies, looked up at him. "Can I help you?" she asked gently, though her tone carried the alertness of someone trained to notice what others missed. "I got a call," Darius said, voice steady but low. "About a patient, Eleanor Whitfield." The name changed something in her expression. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. "Room 512, she said, after a brief pause. "But she's expecting you." Darius frowned slightly, a crease forming between his brows. Expecting him? That word didn't sit right. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. Each floor number blinking upward felt like a quiet countdown, not to something ending, but something beginning. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched out in silence. White walls, soft footsteps, machines humming behind closed doors. He found room 512 at the far end. He hesitated, not out of fear, but because something inside him, something old, told him that whatever waited behind that door would change the direction of his life again. He knocked once, then stepped in. Eleanor Whitfield sat upright in the hospital bed, a clean bandage wrapped across her forehead where the blood had been the night before. Without the chaos of the crash, she looked composed, her silver hair neatly brushed back, her posture straight despite the circumstances. She appeared to be in her late 60s, but her eyes, sharp, unwavering, carried decades of decisions, of authority, of seeing through people. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit. Marcus Hale, mid-40s, tall, composed, with a habitually guarded expression shaped by years as a court clerk and legal aid. His job had trained him to observe without reacting, to listen without revealing. "Mr. Cole," Marcus said, his voice measured, "thank you for coming." Darius nodded once, his attention already shifting to Eleanor. For a moment, no one spoke. Then she studied him, not casually, not politely, but deliberately, as if she were reading a file that wasn't written on paper. "You were there yesterday," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze didn't soften. "You had somewhere else to be." Darius exhaled quietly. "Yes." A pause stretched between them. Pause stretched. "You could have kept driving," Eleanor continued, her voice calm but precise, each word placed carefully, like evidence. Darius didn't look away. "No, ma'am." That answer lingered in the room longer than expected. Marcus shifted slightly, glancing between them, sensing something unspoken passing through the silence. Eleanor leaned back just slightly, her fingers resting on the edge of the blanket. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Cole?" Darius shook his head once. No, ma'am. Another pause. I'm Judge Eleanor Whitfield, she said. The name landed differently now, not as a stranger, but as weight. Darius felt it, not in panic, not in fear, but in understanding. The pieces connected quickly. The courthouse, the closed docket, the voice on the phone. Marcus stepped forward slightly, his tone formal. Judge Whitfield presides over several parole review cases in Fulton County. Darius's jaw tightened, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice. But she noticed because she had spent years noticing things like that. And yesterday, Eleanor said, her eyes still fixed on him, you missed your hearing. It wasn't a question. Darius nodded. Yes, ma'am. Silence again. But this time, it felt different, not heavy, measured. You stopped anyway, she said. Yes. Why? That question wasn't legal. It wasn't procedural. It was personal. Darius took a breath, slower this time. Because if I didn't, he said carefully, then none of the last 6 years would have meant anything. For the first time, something in Eleanor's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Marcus glanced at her, just briefly. He had worked with her long enough to recognize that look, the moment she stopped evaluating facts, and started considering truth. Eleanor nodded once, almost imperceptibly. I see. But the way she said it suggested she saw more than he expected, and perhaps more than he understood himself. Because somewhere between that highway and this room, Darius hadn't just made a decision. He had revealed who he had become. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the hospital room, soft but persistent, like time itself refusing to stop, even when lives quietly shifted within its passing. Judge Eleanor Whitfield sat with her reading glasses low on her nose, a thick folder resting in her lap. The name printed on the tab, Darius Cole, looked ordinary, almost forgettable, but she had learned long ago that names rarely told the truth. Stories did. Across the room, Darius stood near the window, hands clasped loosely in front of him, his posture calm but not relaxed. He wasn't nervous in the way most people were in front of a judge. There was no fidgeting, no rehearsed words, just stillness, the kind that came from someone who had already faced worse outcomes. Marcus Hale stood beside the bed, arms folded, watching quietly. He had seen thousands of case files, thousands of defendants. Most fell into patterns, excuses, deflection, promises made too easily. But this one, he wasn't sure yet. Eleanor opened the file. 22 years old, she read aloud. Aggravated assault, bar fight, one victim hospitalized. Her voice was neutral, but her eyes lifted briefly toward Darius. Darius didn't flinch. Yes, ma'am. Alcohol involved. Yes, she turned the page. Sentence reduced, parole granted after 18 months. Another page. 6 years of compliance, no violations, employment consistent. Her fingers paused slightly on that line. Auto repair shop, Marcus added, glancing at the document. North side of Atlanta, owner filed 3 separate commendations. Darius gave a small nod. He gave me a second chance. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued reading. The file unfolded not as a legal document, but as a quiet ledger of choices. Early check-ins, drug tests, community service hours logged without complaint, letters from supervisors, short, practical, but consistent, reliable, on time. Doesn't cause trouble, no praise. But no failure either. And somehow, that mattered more. She turned another page. EMT certification, she said, almost to herself. Darius shifted slightly. Got it during parole, nights and weekends. Why? The question came sharper this time. Darius took a breath, slower than before. Because I needed to learn how to fix something. Eleanor looked up. Not cars, he added quietly. Something that mattered. The room fell silent again. Marcus glanced between them, his expression tightening just slightly. He had heard many explanations before, but this one, it didn't feel practiced. Eleanor closed the file halfway, her fingers resting on the edge. 6 years, she said. No incidents, no relapses, no missed appointments. Yes, ma'am. And yesterday, she continued, her gaze narrowing just slightly, you missed the one that mattered most. Darius nodded once. I did. No defense. No justification. Just fact. Eleanor leaned back slightly, studying him again, but differently this time. Not as a subject, not as a case, as a question. "Do you believe you've changed, Mr. Cole?" she asked. Darius didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know, but because he understood the weight of the question. "I think," he began slowly, "I stopped being the person who only thinks about himself." Marcus shifted again, this time more noticeably. That wasn't the answer most people gave. Eleanor's eyes held his. "And yesterday proved that?" Darius shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am." A pause. "That was just who I am now." The simplicity of it settled into the room like something fragile. Eleanor reopened the file, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was remembering. Cases where people said the right things, but did the wrong ones. Cases where people broke under pressure. And then this one, a man who said almost nothing, but did the one thing that cost him everything. Her fingers tapped lightly against the folder. "You understand," she said finally, her tone returning, slightly, to its judicial edge, "that the law doesn't account for intentions, only actions." "Yes, ma'am." "And your action, missing that hearing, has consequences." "Yes." No hesitation, no argument. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then slowly she closed the file. Not with finality, but with consideration. Because for the first time, this wasn't just about what Darius had done 6 years ago, or even yesterday. It was about something more difficult, something the law didn't measure easily, who he had become when no one was watching. The hospital conference room was small, window-lit, and far too quiet for a decision that carried the weight of a man's future. Darius Cole sat at the far end of the table, shoulders squared, hands resting flat against the surface as if grounding himself in something solid. He wore the same jacket, the same calm expression, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Not fear, not hope, just acceptance. The kind that comes when a person has already prepared for the worst. Across from him sat Judge Eleanor Whitfield, her posture straight despite the faint fatigue beneath her eyes. The bandage on her forehead remained, a quiet reminder that this meeting existed only because of what had happened the day before. Beside her stood Marcus Hale, silent as always, but more alert now, his gaze sharper, measuring every word exchanged. 2 additional figures had joined them. One was Thomas Reed, a man in his early 50s, the district compliance officer. He had a rigid frame, short graying hair, and a voice that carried the weight of rules he had followed his entire life. Years ago, a procedural mistake in his early career had nearly cost him everything, and since then, he had built himself into a man who trusted systems more than people. It showed in the way he held his folder, tight, precise, unyielding. Next to him sat Angela Brooks, a legal advisor in her late 30s, composed and observant, her sharp eyes softened only slightly by experience. Unlike Thomas, she had spent years working public defense before shifting into advisory roles, long enough to understand that the law and justice were not always aligned. Thomas cleared his throat first. "Let's proceed," he said, his tone clipped, efficient. "Mr. Cole failed to appear at his scheduled parole termination hearing yesterday at 2 p.m. According to protocol, that absence constitutes a violation, triggering automatic review and potential warrant issuance." Each word landed like a stone. Darius didn't react. Angela glanced briefly at Eleanor, then back at the documents. "The circumstances of his absence," she said carefully, "are highly unusual." Thomas didn't look at her. "The law does not operate on unusual. It operates on consistency." Eleanor remained silent. Thomas continued, flipping a page. "If exceptions are made based on subjective interpretation, we undermine the integrity of the system. Today, it's this case. Tomorrow, it's another." Darius listened, but his thoughts drifted. Not away, but inward. 6 years. 6 years of waking before sunrise. 6 years of proving, quietly, that he was no longer the man defined by a single moment of anger. And now, it all balanced here. Not on what he had done wrong, but on what he had done right. And somehow, that felt harder to defend. Angela leaned forward slightly. "And if the system punishes someone for saving a life," she asked, "what does that say about the integrity we're protecting?" Thomas finally looked at her. "It says that the rules apply equally. That's the point. Equally, she repeated softly. Or blindly. The tension in the room tightened, not loudly, but enough to be felt. Marcus shifted his weight subtly, watching Eleanor now. Because this was where her decision would matter. Eleanor's fingers rested lightly on the table. She wasn't looking at the documents anymore. She was looking at Darius. You understood the risk, she said. Darius met her gaze. Yes, ma'am. And you chose to stop anyway? Yes. A pause. Even knowing what it could cost you? Darius nodded once. Yes. No hesitation. No regret. Thomas exhaled through his nose. Intentions do not negate consequences. Darius turned his head slightly toward him, not confrontational, not defensive. I didn't stop because I thought it would help me, he said calmly. I stopped because she needed help. The simplicity of it cut through the room sharper than any argument. Angela lowered her gaze briefly, as if absorbing something heavier than words. Thomas said nothing this time. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing, not in doubt, but in thought. For years she had believed in the structure of the law, the clarity of it, the certainty. But clarity had limits, because nowhere in those pages did it say what to do when a man proved his change not in compliance, but in sacrifice. She looked out the window for a brief moment. The city moved as it always did, cars passing, people walking, lives continuing without pause. Then she looked back at Darius. Mr. Cole, she said quietly, when was the last time doing the right thing cost you everything? Darius didn't answer. He didn't need to, because they all knew. It was yesterday, and now the question wasn't whether the law had been broken. It was whether justice could still be found within it. The room fell silent again, waiting. Morning settled gently over Atlanta, sunlight slipping through the hospital blinds in thin golden lines, as if the day itself was waiting quietly for a decision that would not echo loudly, but would change everything. The room felt smaller than before, not because of its size, but because of what it now held. Silence. Expectation. Consequence. Darius Cole stood where he had been, unmoving, his presence steady like a man who had already accepted whatever would come next. There was no pleading in him, no desperation, only a quiet readiness. At 32, his life had taught him that some moments could not be fought, only faced. Across the table, Judge Eleanor Whitfield held the pen. It was an ordinary pen, black, simple, unremarkable. But in her hand, it carried the weight of years, years of rulings, years of decisions that divided right from wrong with careful precision. She had built her career on clarity, on the belief that the law, when followed correctly, could shape order from chaos. But today, clarity felt incomplete. Marcus Hale stood just behind her shoulder, watching closely, though his expression remained composed. Thomas Reed sat upright, his fingers pressed tightly against his folder, as if holding on to structure itself. Angela Brooks leaned slightly forward, her gaze not on the documents, but on Eleanor, because this was no longer about the file. It was about her. Eleanor looked down at the final page again. Failure to appear, it read, a simple phrase, clean, defined, absolute, and yet it said nothing about why. Her eyes lifted slowly to Darius. You understood the consequences, she said one last time, not as a question, but as a final confirmation. Yes, ma'am. And you would make the same decision again? There was no pause. Yes. Not louder, not stronger, just certain. Something in Eleanor's chest shifted, not dramatically, but enough to settle something that had been unresolved since the moment she opened that file. For years, she had believed that justice required distance, objectivity, a separation from emotion. But distance had never been tested like this. Because this time, she wasn't reading about a moment. She had lived it. She remembered the smoke, the pressure in her chest, the fear she hadn't allowed herself to name. And then, his voice, calm, steady, certain. A stranger who chose not to be one. Eleanor exhaled slowly, then lowered her gaze back to the document. Thomas shifted slightly. Judge Whitfield, he said, careful but firm. Any deviation from protocol should be clearly justified. Angela didn't speak. Marcus didn't move. The room held its breath. Eleanor adjusted the paper once, just slightly, aligning it as if precision still mattered. Then, without announcement, without ceremony, she signed. The sound of pen against paper was soft, but final. Marcus straightened almost imperceptibly. Angela exhaled quietly. Thomas said nothing, but his grip on the folder loosened, just slightly. Eleanor set the pen down. "Parole terminated," she said. Not loudly, not emotionally, but with certainty. Darius didn't react immediately, because for a moment, the words didn't feel real. 6 years. 6 years reduced to a single sentence. He nodded once, slowly, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Eleanor looked at him again, her expression no longer guarded. "You could have kept driving," she said. Darius met her gaze. "No, ma'am," he replied quietly. "I really couldn't." This time, she nodded. "I know." There was no smile, but there was understanding. And sometimes that meant more. Darius turned to leave, his steps measured, almost careful, as if he were stepping into something unfamiliar. Not fear, not uncertainty, freedom. At the door, he paused, not because he had something to say, but because something inside him needed to settle. Then he walked out. No one stopped him. No one called him back. Outside, the city felt the same, but lighter, and for the first time in 6 years. There was nothing behind him. In the quiet space after everything had settled, the story did not end with a signature on paper. It ended with something far deeper, something unseen. Because sometimes what we call coincidence is not coincidence at all. A man had only 14 minutes left to reclaim his life. A woman who held the power to judge him was placed directly in his path. A single decision, to stop, to help, to choose compassion over fear, changed everything. And maybe, just maybe, that was not luck. Maybe that was grace. The kind of grace that doesn't arrive loudly, but quietly rearranges moments, placing people exactly where they need to be. The kind of grace that asks nothing from you, except that you do what is right when it matters most. Because in our daily lives, we are all given these moments, not always dramatic, not always life-changing at first glance, but real. A chance to help someone, a chance to choose kindness when no one is watching, a chance to do the right thing, even when it costs us something. And maybe you won't see the result immediately. Maybe it will feel like you lost something. But just like Darius, what is taken in one moment can be returned in ways you never expected. So if you're watching this right now, remember this. God sees what others don't. God remembers what the world forgets, and God has a way of returning what you thought was lost. If this story touched your heart, take a moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment. I believe in grace, and subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this, stories that remind us who we are meant to be. And wherever you are, may God bless you, protect you, and guide your path, especially in those quiet moments, when doing the right thing feels the hardest.
Thì sẽ khi ta yêu niềm hạnh phúc có